Good evening. I'm Mrs. Fullard, and I'm the subject lead for Design and Nutrition at Fearnhill School. Chapter 8. The Queen's Croquet Garden. A large rose tree stood at the entrance of the garden. The roses growing on it were white, but there were 3 gardeners at it, busily painting them red. Alice thought this was a curious thing, and she went nearer to watch them. And just as she came up to them, she heard them say, "Look out now, 5. Don't go splashing that paint all over me like that." "I can't help it," said 5 in a sulky tone. 7 jogged my elbow. On which 7 looked up and said, "That's right, 5. Always laying the blame on others." "You'd better not talk," said 5. "I heard the Queen saying only yesterday that you deserve to be beheaded." "For what?" said the first one that spoke. "That's none of your business, 2, said 7. "Yes, it is his business," said 5, "and I will tell him. It was for bringing the cook tulip roots instead of onions." 7 flew himself down the bush and just begun with, "Well, of all the unjust things," when he glanced and saw Alice, who was watching them from a distance, and he checked himself suddenly. The others looked around too, and they all bowed low. Would you tell me," said Alice timidly, "why you're painting those roses?" 5 and 7 said nothing, and they both looked at 2. 2 began in a low, quiet voice. "Well, the fact is, you see, miss, this is meant to be a red bush, but we planted a white one by mistake. If the Queen found out, she'd cut our heads off, you know. So you see, miss, we do our best before she comes to." At that moment, 5, who had anxiously been looking round the garden, called out, "The Queen, the Queen!" And the 3 gardeners instantly threw themselves flat upon their faces. At that sound of many, many footsteps, and Alice turned round, eager to see the Queen. First came 10 soldiers carrying clubs. These were all shaped like the gardeners, oblong and flat, with their hands and their feet at the corners. Next were 10 courtiers. These were ornamented all over with diamonds, and they walked 2 by 2, as the soldiers did. After this came the royal children. There was 10 of them in total, and the little dears came jumping merrily along hand in hand, in pairs again. They were all ornamented with those hearts too. Next came the guests, mostly kings and queens, and among them Alice recognised the white rabbit. It was talking in a hurried, nervous manner, smiling at everything that was said, and went by without even noticing her. Then followed the Knave of Hearts, carrying the king's crown on a crimson velvet cushion. And next, after all of the grand procession, came the King and Queen of Hearts. Alice was rather doubtful whether she ought to lie down on her face like the 3 gardeners, but she could not remember having heard such a rule at any time about processions. And besides, what would be the use of a procession, she thought, if no one could see you, if all of your faces were down and you couldn't see anything? So she stood there, still, where she was, and she waited. When the procession came opposite Alice, they all stood and looked at her, and the Queen said severely, "Who is this?" She said it to the Knave of Hearts, who only bowed and smiled in reply. "Idiot," said the Queen, tossing her head impatiently and turning to Alice. She went on, "What's your name, child?" My name is Alice. So pleased to meet you, your Majesty," said Alice very politely. But she added to herself, "Why, they're only a pack of cards after all. I needn't be afraid of them." "And who are these?" said the Queen, pointing to the gardeners who were lying next to the rose tree. For you see, when they were lying on their faces, and their patterns on their back were the only thing showing, that was all you could see, and you couldn't tell whether they were the gardeners, the soldiers, the courtiers, or even one of her 3 children. "Now, how should I know?" said Alice, surprised at her own courage. It's no business of mine." The Queen turned crimson with fury, and after glaring at Alice for a moment like a wild beast, she shouted, "Off with her head! Off! Nonsense, said Alice, very loudly and decidedly, and the Queen went silent. The King laid his hand upon the Queen's arm and timidly said, "Consider, my dear, she's only a child." The Queen turned angrily to him and said to the knave, "Turn them over." The knave did so very carefully by 1 foot per card. "Get up," said the Queen in a shrill, loud voice, and the 3 gardeners instantly jumped up and began bowing to the Queen and the King and the royal children and everybody else. "Leave it off," screamed the Queen. "You're making me giddy." And then, turning to the rose tree, she went on, "What have you been doing here?" May it please your Majesty, said 2 in a humble tone, going down on one knee as he spoke. We've been trying to I see, said the Queen, who had meanwhile been examining the roses. "Off with their heads," she shouted, and the procession moved on, 3 of the soldiers remaining behind to execute the unfortunate gardeners, who ran to Alice for protection. "You shan't be beheaded," said Alice, and she put them into a very large flower pot that stood nearby. The 3 soldiers wandered around for a minute, looking for them, couldn't find them, and then quietly marched off after the others. "Are their heads off?" shouted the Queen. Yes, your Majesty, if you please, their heads are gone," said the soldiers. They shouted in reply. "That's right. Can you play croquet?" shouted the Queen. The soldiers went silent and looked at Alice, as the question had evidently been meant for her. Yes, shouted Alice back again. "Come on then," roared the Queen, and the Alice joined the procession, wondering very much what would happen next.